Welcome back to project number 3 of this section. And this project is going to be the most exciting one, because now we will take everything that we learned in the first 2 projects to a whole new level and build a really cool and amazing game. And this is the game that I was talking about, and it's called the Pig Game. Now this project here is really going to be a practice project. So a project where you and me will together reinforce all the skills that you have learned up until this point. Because remember from the last section, reinforcing knowledge is one of the most important things that you can do to learn, right? So in this project, I will do a little bit less explaining than before, at least about the stuff that we already learned, because we are really just practicing here, okay? Now, if you're in a hurry and just want to learn the basics, please feel free to skip this project. But of course, I would still really advise you to code along with me here. But now let's see how this game actually works. And in fact, you can try that along with me, because this time I hosted this demo on a live website. So you can access that by piggame720p.netlify.app. And the link is also in the README file of the repository for this course on github.com. But anyway, this is more of a real game now, because we actually have 2 players. So you can play this with a friend or something, or just against yourself. So the idea is that we roll a dice. And so now I'm player number 1. So this one is now the active player. So I roll a dice. And so you see that I rolled a 2. And so this number gets added to my current score down here. Okay, so this is my current score for the current round, and this here is my total score. And so let's see how that's going to work. So I can roll the dice again now if I want to. And now I rolled a 4, and that 4 got added to the 2 that I had previously. So now that's 6. And now I can choose to hold this score. So if I click this button, this score of the current round will get added to my total score, which right now is 0. And so when I hold, then my score will be 0 now, and we switched to player number 2. And now I can click roll dice again. So we rolled a 2, and I can hold again. And so now player 2 has 2 points. Now the thing here is that whenever we roll a 1, we lose all our current score, and it's then the next player's turn. And so that's why sometimes we need to hold our points. So let me show that to you. And oh, indeed, I rolled a 1 right away. And so now it's player 2 again. So let's keep rolling the dice. And I will now again wait for a 1 so that you can see that all my current score will be lost. So that's a lot of points already there. And now I rolled a 1, and the player lost all the points. Okay, so I could have held the points, and then I would have added all these points here to my score. So let's do that here. And again, a 1. And so, yeah, now here I hold, and I added them to these points. And I think by now you get how the game works, right? So the first player to reach 100 points then wins the game. But I will now not demonstrate that, because that's going to take too long. So we have these 2 buttons here, and then we also have, just like in the previous game, a way of resetting the game. So when I click here, as you might expect, this dice will disappear, and all the scores are set back to 0. And to understand this game a little bit better, for this application I designed something called a flowchart. So let's take a look at that. And this is what a flowchart looks like. So basically it's a representation of everything that can happen in the application. So on the left side, we have in yellow the possible actions that the user can take. And then from there, we see what happens in the application as one of these options is basically chosen. So as one of the actions is executed. So whenever the user rolls the dice, so clicks that roll dice button, then we need to generate a random dice roll. Then we display that dice roll, and then we check whether it is a 1. If it's not a 1, then add that dice roll to the current score, and of course display it. Right? So that is exactly the behavior that we saw when we tested out the game earlier, right? Now, if the dice roll is actually a 1, then simply switch the player. And so in this case, the dice roll will not get added to the current score. Next, the other option is that the user wants to hold his score, and then we add the current score to the total score. Once that is done, we must check if the score is above or equal 100. Because as I said, the player wins whenever the score is at least 100 points, right? And if it's not, then we just switch the player and the game keeps on running. Finally, when the user chooses to reset the game, we simply set all scores to 0 and set the player number 1 back to being the starting player. All right, so this is a very nice way, again, to visualize what happens in the application, and it's also a very good guide for us to actually implement the application in code. So usually whenever I build a project like this one, I like to draw a flowchart like this. And it doesn't need to have all this precision right from the start, so we can just start out with a rough sketch without the complete plan of what we're going to build. But anyway, this is very helpful before we actually start writing code to have a good idea of what we will have to do. And if you want to build your own flowcharts that look like this, you can do so on diagrams.net. So that's where I designed this flowchart, and it's a very nice online drawing application that is completely free and really easy and fast to use. Okay, and so now as always, let's open up our project folder. So I have the starter files here already, and now I need a new VS Code window. And then I just open the Pig game. And this time, since the application needs this whole space, let's actually put it here on a separate desktop. And then as we test out, I will just move here from one desktop to the other. So let's make this bigger this time. And so, like always, we already have all our files here. So let's take a look at them. And JavaScript. So here, as always, just the use strict. Then here we have all the styles that we need for the application, and we will take a look at them as we go through the project. And then finally, the HTML file. Okay, and I also actually included the image of this flowchart here for you, so that you can maybe take a look at it yourself to make sure that you really understand how it works. Okay, so take a minute or two to maybe test the app again and check out this flowchart before we actually start. All right. Also, I wanted to show you that I have one image here for each of the dices. So dice 1 looks like this, like 2 looks like this, and so on and so forth. So we have one image for each of the possible 6 numbers. So that's going to be important later. But now let's just start to write a little bit of code here. Let's get ourselves a new terminal here so that we can take a look at the application as it looks right now. And here I like to minimize it a little bit. Live server. Okay. And so this is our live version of the Pig game. So again, we are here at this localhost at port 8080. And if you're seeing some other port, that's no problem at all, as long as it works. So maybe you still have something running on this port, maybe from the previous project, and then this project will run on another port. That doesn't really matter. So right now, in the starting point, this is what our application looks like. But of course, in the demo, we don't see the dice in the beginning, and we don't see any scores here. Okay? And so the first thing that we're going to do is to basically put these scores to 0 and make this dice disappear. And so that's going to be basically the starting condition here. So let's go back here to the code, and let me just show you where these initial values come from. So this is the 43 score that we just saw, and this is the 24. And so let's take a moment to inspect the code, because as you already know, we need the class names, and in this case also the IDs, to then identify and select the elements. So basically here we have one of these sections here for each of the players. And you see that the first one is player 0 and the second one is player 1. And I will explain you why the players are called 0 and 1 instead of 1 and 2, probably in the next lecture. So it will make sense by then, okay? But now about the scores, they are stored in this element and in this one here. And so you see both of them have the score class, but then each of them has a different ID. And so this time we need to select these two elements using their unique ID instead of a class name. So that's the ID of score -- 0 and score -- 1. So let's do that. So const score 1 and then document.querySelector. So this is the way that we learned it before. And now here we actually need the hash symbol. So score 0. So actually I'm interested in 0 here. Okay, and so again, now we used this hash because that is the selector for the ID. And the dot that we used to use is only for classes. Okay? Now, when we're selecting using an ID, then there's actually another way of selecting an element. And right now, that's exactly what we're doing. So we're interested in IDs, not in classes. And so let me show you that other way of selecting elements that only works by ID. So let's call this one score 1. And then again, we use document, but then we're not calling query selector. Instead, we call get element by ID. And then here we just pass in the name of the ID. So just score 1. So without the hash here, because now we're not writing a selector, we are only passing in the name of the ID that we're looking for. Okay, so this works exactly the same as this, but the get element by ID is supposed to be a little bit faster than query selector. But I guess that's only relevant if you're selecting like thousands of elements at once. So usually I like to always use query selector, but I still wanted to show you that there also exists get element by ID. All right. And actually let's call these two here score 0 L, which stands for element, because you might then confuse maybe this variable here for simply the score value of player 0, right? And so in this case, we are making it really clear that this is a DOM element. So score 0 L. All right. Okay. So we're selecting these here, and now we can use the variables to do something on them. And again, we do that because probably we will need to do something with these selected elements multiple times throughout the application. And so we just define them once at the top of our file instead of having to select the same elements over and over again. So let's just add a comment here. And comments are also a good way of structuring the code and also of planning how we will build some features. So selecting elements. And so in this project, we will try to get a little bit more used to actually writing comments. All right. Anyway, let's now set these initial conditions of score 0 element. And then, as you know, we use text content, and then we set it to 0. All right. And now the same for score 1. Score 1 element dot text content to 0. And here we are specifying numbers, not strings, but JavaScript will then automatically convert them to strings to actually display them on the page. So if we go now to the application, that should already be in effect. And indeed, you see that now the scores are actually at 0. Great. Now all we have to do is to hide this dice here. And so let's do that using the technique that we learned in the previous project, which is basically creating a hidden class and then add that hidden class here at the beginning. Okay, So let's go to our style. And right now I don't have that class yet. So let's just create it. And I can close the terminal here. Let's just do that at the very end. So we create a class like this, and then we just set the display to none. So that's exactly the class that we had in the previous project as well. Okay, and so now we can just add that class to the dice at the beginning of the game. So that's easy enough, but first we need to select it. So let's call it dice L for the dice element. Let's check out what the ID or the class of it is. And here we see that it's actually just this dice class. So this image with this class of dice. So document.query selector dice. And so here we have the starting conditions. And now let's simply do dice element dot class list dot add, and now simply the string which contains the name of the class, and that's the hidden class. Give it a save. Let's check it out, and indeed now the dice is gone. And let's see the HTML here actually, and now indeed we have the hidden class here besides the dice class. Great. And then as we implement the roll dice functionality, of course, we will want the dice to be visible, and then we can simply remove that class again from the dice. Okay. And actually, that's exactly what we're going to do in the next video.